He left them there on purpose. That was the part Margaret Ellison could not stop thinking about as the snow came down in sheets around her, and her 6-year-old son pressed his wet face against her arm and stopped asking questions. Samuel had stopped asking questions an hour ago, and that scared her more than the cold. Dalton Hare had known the storm was coming. The station master in Pueblo had told anyone who would listen, 2, maybe 3 days of hard weather moving down from the mountains. Dalton had known, and he had sent his man Briggs out to meet her wagon anyway, and Briggs had driven them 12 miles east on a trail that didn't lead to any ranch Margaret had ever heard described. And then Briggs had climbed down from the driver's seat, unhitched the lead horse, and ridden away without a single word. Not one word. Not even the decency of a lie. She had called after him. She had called until her voice broke. If you've ever stood somewhere and realized, all at once, that every decision you made for the past 4 months led you to the worst possible place you could be, leave a like on this video and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now, because the people who find this channel deserve to know every story we have left to tell. The last clear memory Margaret had of warmth was a kitchen in Ohio. Not a grand kitchen, a narrow one with a window that stuck in the summer and a wood stove that ran hot on the left side and cold on the right. And her husband Peter had always stood on the left side to stay comfortable while she stood on the right and got cold and never once complained about it, because that was just the way things were in a house where you loved the person you were standing next to. Peter died in March of 1891, a wagon accident on a muddy road, the kind of accident that didn't make any sense and left no one to be angry at. He was 31 years old, Margaret was 28. Samuel was 5 and didn't fully understand what the funeral meant, except that his father wasn't coming back, and his mother cried at night when she thought he was asleep. She had tried to hold on to the house. She had tried for 7 months, taking in laundry, selling eggs, asking her neighbor Mrs. Farwell to watch Samuel on the days she could find work at the dry goods store. She had tried until the numbers stopped working no matter how many times she added them up differently, and then she had tried for another 6 weeks after that, just to be certain. The advertisement appeared in the Ohio Farmer in October. Margaret almost didn't read it. She almost set the paper aside without finishing the back page, and sometimes, standing in the snow outside Pueblo with her son going quiet against her side, she wished she had. Widower, 44, established ranch owner, Colorado Territory, seeks respectable woman of good character to share household and provide steady home for herself and any children. All correspondents welcomed. Respond to D. Hare, Hare Creek Ranch, Pueblo County. She wrote to him 3 times before she let herself believe he was real. His replies were careful and formal, and said exactly the right things. He was lonely, he was responsible, he wanted a proper family. He understood her situation completely and respected it. He enclosed a photograph of himself standing in front of a large, well-built ranch house, hat in hand, looking serious and prosperous. She told herself she wasn't a fool. She told herself she was making a reasonable decision for her son's sake. She told herself that plenty of women had made this exact choice and landed on their feet just fine. She wrote him a 4th letter saying she would come. The journey from Columbus to Pueblo took 11 days by rail, with a change in St. Louis and another in Kansas City, and Samuel was sick for most of the Kansas leg, and Margaret held him in her lap in the rail car and pressed her hand to his forehead and counted her remaining money in her head every few hours, the way you do when the number is small enough to memorize. When they arrived in Pueblo on a Tuesday afternoon, the air was cold and dry and smelled like pine resin and something she couldn't name, and Samuel pressed his nose to the station window and said, "Mama, it's different here." And she said, "Yes, it is," and felt something she was careful not to call hope. Briggs was waiting at the station. He was a compact, weathered man in his 50s with a hat pulled low and no particular expression. He said his name was Briggs, that he worked for Mr. Hare, and that he had instructions to drive her and her boy out to the property. "Is Mr. Hare not coming himself?" Margaret asked. "He's got business to attend to," Briggs said. "He'll meet you at the ranch." She thought nothing of it. People were busy. Ranchers were busy. She loaded her 2 trunks into the wagon bed and helped Samuel up onto the seat, and they drove out of Pueblo heading east, and the town shrank behind them, and the land opened up into something enormous and gray and cold, and Samuel fell asleep against her shoulder inside the first hour. She noticed, somewhere around the second hour, that they weren't on a main road anymore. "How much farther?" she asked. Briggs said nothing. Mr. Briggs, how much farther to the Hare Creek Ranch? A ways, he said. She watched the land. She didn't know Colorado, couldn't read the terrain the way she could read the flat farmland of Ohio, but she had a feeling, the kind of feeling that doesn't announce itself loudly, that arrives quietly and sits in the bottom of your stomach and waits for you to pay attention to it. She had been ignoring that feeling since Briggs's first silence. When he stopped the wagon and climbed down and began unhitching the horse, she understood all at once what was happening, and the understanding hit her like something physical. What are you doing? Her voice came out strange, flat and high at the same time. Briggs didn't look at her. He worked the harness with the efficiency of a man who had done this before. Mr. Briggs. She climbed down from the wagon. Samuel stirred and opened his eyes. Stop. Stop what you're doing and tell me what is happening. Nothing to tell. He swung up onto the horse's back. He still hadn't looked at her directly. You cannot leave us here. There is a storm coming. My son is 6 years old. He pulled the horse around. Mr. Hare sends his apologies, Briggs said, and that was the only thing he said. And then he rode east, and the sound of hooves faded, and the wind came up, and Margaret stood in the road, and for 30 seconds she simply could not think at all. Then she heard Samuel say, Mama? In the small voice he used when he was frightened, and she thought, not here. Don't fall apart here. It's all right, she said, and turned back to the wagon. We're going to figure this out. She had been saying some version of that sentence since March. The storm didn't announce itself. It gathered weight gradually, the way serious storms do, pressing the temperature down, degree by degree, and pushing the light out of the sky until what remained wasn't really light at all, just a gray flatness that gave nothing back. Margaret got Samuel under the canvas she pulled from the wagon bed and put both her coats on him and held him against her body and tried to think clearly. She had roughly $15, 2 trunks of household goods, no food beyond what remained from their travel rations, half a loaf of bread, some dried apple slices, a paper of salt, and no idea where she was. She had a wagon with no horse. She had a child who was beginning to shiver in a rhythmic, persistent way that told her the cold was winning. She thought about Peter, not in a sentimental way, just practically. Thought about what he would have done, what he would have said. Peter had been a steady man, not brilliant, not particularly resourceful, but steady. He would have stayed calm. He would have said there had to be something, some option she hadn't found yet. She was still looking for it when she heard the horse. She heard it before she saw anything, a single horse moving at a controlled pace somewhere inside the wall of snow, and she stood up and moved out from under the canvas and called out, because there was nothing else to do. Hello, hello, is someone there? The horse appeared out of the gray like something her mind had assembled from desperation, and the man on it pulled up short and looked down at her with an expression that was not particularly warm or welcoming, just startled and then calculating, the way a practical person's face goes when they've just encountered a problem they didn't expect. What in the... He stopped. He looked at the wagon. He looked at Samuel, who had crept out from under the canvas and was standing in the snow up to his boot tops. How long have you been out here? I don't know exactly. 2 hours? Perhaps 3? He swore under his breath. Not at her, just at the situation. He was looking around the way someone looks when they're checking for other people, for other variables, trying to assess the full scope of what they've ridden into. Is it just you two? Yes? Where were you headed? Margaret considered the question. It had, at this point, a fairly bitter answer. I was told I was headed to the Hare Creek Ranch. I was left here by a man called Briggs. Something moved across the man's face. He knew the name. Whatever the name meant to him, it wasn't good. That's 12 miles back east, he said. You weren't headed there. You were brought out here. Yes. She kept her voice level. I understand that now. He looked at Samuel again. The boy had stopped shivering so violently, which Margaret knew was not a good sign. It was what happened when the body started to give up on generating heat and simply waited. My place is 2 miles north, the man said. It's not much, but it's warm and the roof holds. He paused. Name's Nathaniel Cross. Margaret Ellison. She put her hand on Samuel's shoulder. This is my son Samuel. Nathaniel Cross looked at her for a moment longer with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something between reluctance and resignation, like a man who has made up his mind before he quite wanted to and is acknowledging the fact. He dismounted and started moving her smaller trunk toward the wagon bed's lashing points, securing it without asking permission or offering explanation. "We'll have to leave the large one," he said. "I'll come back for it when the storm breaks." "All right." "Boy," he said, looking at Samuel, "can you hold on to me on horseback?" Samuel looked at his mother. She nodded. "Yes, sir," Samuel said. "Good." He picked Samuel up without ceremony and settled him in front of the saddle, then turned to Margaret. "You'll ride behind me. It'll be slow going." "I can manage." He gave her a brief sideways look that she couldn't interpret, then cupped his hands to help her mount. She managed it without particular grace. She was stiff with cold and her coat was soaked through on the left shoulder. But she managed it, and she put her arms around his waist because there was nothing else to hold, and the horse moved north into the storm. Nathaniel Cross had built his place alone. That was apparent from the moment Margaret saw it. A cabin and a barn and a small outbuilding arranged with the practical logic of a man who has to do everything himself and has organized the space accordingly. Nothing was decorative. Everything had a reason and a position and showed signs of careful, constant maintenance. The cabin was small. The barn was in better repair than the cabin. He got them inside and built up the fire and the stove, and didn't say much while he did it. Margaret worked on Samuel, got the wet coat off, got him wrapped in the blanket Nathaniel pulled from a chest by the wall, got him sitting close to the heat with his cold hands wrapped around a tin cup of water that was warming slowly on the stovetop. Samuel's color came back in stages, the gray draining from his face over the course of 20 minutes. He fell asleep sitting up. Margaret stood at the stove and felt the cold leave her own body in a long, slow exhale, and for a moment the relief of it made her eyes sting. She didn't cry. She was done crying in front of people she didn't know. Nathaniel was at the table with his boots off, examining a cut on his hand from something she hadn't noticed before. He wrapped it himself with a piece of cloth and didn't ask her to help. "You want to tell me what happened?" he said. Not unkindly, just plainly. So she told him. She didn't dramatize it, and she didn't minimize it. She told him about Peter dying, about the advertisement, about the letters, about the train journey, about Briggs. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, which was more than she expected. Most men interrupted. Most people interrupted. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Dalton Hare," he said. "You know him. Know of him." He picked up the piece of cloth and rewrapped the cut with more attention than it strictly needed. "He owns about 6,000 acres east of here. Profitable operation. His mother has been selecting his wives for him since he was 22. She picks the ones that fit, and she disposes of the ones that don't." He paused. "You wouldn't have been the first woman brought out this way." Margaret absorbed that. "She didn't think I was suitable," she said. "Wouldn't know the particulars. I know 3 women in Pueblo County who got similar treatment. One made it to a farmhouse half a mile from where she was dropped. The other 2 were luckier than that." He looked up. "I don't say that to frighten you. I say it so you understand this wasn't something personal against you." "That almost makes it worse," Margaret said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. More like recognition. The look of someone who has heard exactly the right sentence at exactly the right moment. "Yeah," he said. "I expect it does." Samuel slept. The storm knocked against the sides of the cabin. The fire did what fires do, and Margaret sat in the only chair that wasn't piled with gear and thought about what came next. "I have no money to speak of," she said, "and no people in this territory. I need to tell you that plainly so there's no misunderstanding about what I'm able to offer in exchange for your hospitality. I didn't rescue you expecting payment. No, but you should know the situation." She looked at her son's sleeping face. "I'll work for my keep. Whatever needs doing around this place. I'm not someone who sits idle, and I'm not looking for charity." Nathaniel Cross looked at her for a long moment. He had a hard face. Not cruel, but weathered in a way that went past the skin, the way years of solitary work in difficult country will do to a person. He looked like a man who had made most of his decisions alone and bore the costs of those decisions without much outward complaint. "There's plenty that needs doing," he said finally. "Winter here is not what you're used to." "I'm not used to being left in a snowstorm either. I imagine I'll adapt." He almost said something. She could see it, some further qualification, some conditional statement about how temporary this arrangement was, how this was practical necessity and nothing else. He didn't say it. Instead, he stood and moved toward the back of the cabin and pulled a second blanket from a shelf. "You can have the cot," he said. "I'll take the floor. Get some sleep." Margaret looked at the cot, a narrow, rough thing along the far wall, and then at the floor, and then at this man she'd known for approximately 3 hours, who had ridden out of a blizzard and taken her in and was now offering to sleep on the floor of his own home. "I won't put you off your own cot," she said. "I've slept on worse." He set the blanket down and moved to the fire to bank it. "You're not in a position to argue about it, Mrs. Ellison. Get some sleep." She sat down on the cot. She listened to the storm for a while. She listened to Samuel breathing. She listened to Nathaniel Cross settle onto the floor near the stove and go still with the quiet ease of a man who could sleep almost anywhere. And she thought about how 12 hours ago she had been on a wagon seat thinking she was almost at the end of her long journey, almost to the place where things would become easier. Instead, she was here, in a strange man's cabin in the middle of a Colorado blizzard, with $12.40 and her son and her 2 coats and a set of good instincts she should have listened to months ago. She had been wrong about most things this past year. She had misjudged distances and people and her own resources. She had made decisions that looked reasonable from the inside and catastrophic from the outside. She had trusted a letter and a photograph and her own desperate hope that things could be better, and she had brought her son 1,000 miles on the strength of it. But she was still here. Samuel was still here, warm and breathing and asleep. And tomorrow, she decided, she would figure out what came next. She pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes, and outside the storm went on, and inside the fire held. She woke before dawn because she was used to waking before dawn. For a moment she didn't know where she was. Then she heard the wind and the creak of unfamiliar wood and smelled wood smoke instead of Ohio, and she knew. Nathaniel Cross was already up. She could hear him in the barn. The sounds traveled through the frozen air with unusual clarity. The scrape of a shovel, the low, reassuring sounds a man makes to livestock in the cold dark. Samuel was still asleep. Margaret sat up and pulled her coat on and found the water pail in the wash basin and did what she could, and then she built up the fire because it had burned low in the night, and found the coffee tin on the shelf beside the stove, and had the water boiling by the time the cabin door opened and Nathaniel came in with a blast of cold air and stomped the snow off his boots. He stopped when he saw the fire. He saw the coffee tin in her hand. "I hope that was all right," she said. He took off his coat. "I've got 2 laying hens," he said. "They're sheltering in the barn. Should be eggs. I'll get them. Storm's still going. It's worse than last night. Then I'll be quick." She poured him a cup of coffee and handed it to him. He took it with the automatic reflex of a man who had been standing in the cold for 2 hours. He drank half of it standing there with his coat half off and his boots still dripping. She went to the barn. She found the hens in the manner that barn hens always arrange themselves, not where you'd expect, not in the obvious place, but wedged in a corner under a feed shelf, indignant and slightly wild-eyed from the noise of the storm. She got 4 eggs with some difficulty and carried them back to the cabin with her coat wrapped around them. Samuel was awake when she got back. "I was sitting up on the cot watching Nathaniel with the focused, uncertain attention that children deploy when they're assessing an adult. They haven't figured out yet." Nathaniel was at the table looking at something on a piece of paper, and he was ignoring the child with the focused, uncertain attention of a man who hasn't spent much time around children and doesn't quite know how they work. "Good morning," Margaret said. Samuel looked at her. "Where are we?" "Mr. Cross's ranch, remember? We rode here last night." "In the snow," Samuel said. "Yes." Samuel looked at Nathaniel again. "Your horse is very big," he said. Nathaniel looked up from his paper. He looked at the boy with the expression of someone who has been addressed in a foreign language and is working out the translation. "He is," he said. "What's his name?" "Gray." Samuel considered this. "That's not very interesting," he said. Margaret started to say something, but Nathaniel made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, although it arrived and departed very quickly, like something he'd caught himself doing. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Margaret cracked eggs into a pan and didn't say anything, because there are moments when the best thing you can do is not interrupt them. The storm kept them inside for 3 full days. By the end of those 3 days, Margaret had learned the geography of the cabin as well as she knew her own kitchen in Ohio, where things were kept, which shelf held what, how the stove ran hot on the back burner, how the door stuck when the temperature dropped below a certain point. She had learned that Nathaniel Cross was not a man who talked for the sake of talking, that he worked from before dawn until after dark, that he could fix almost anything mechanical and almost nothing that required asking for help, and that he had a library of 11 books arranged on a shelf beside his cot in an order she couldn't decipher. But that clearly meant something to him because he noticed immediately when Samuel accidentally moved one, reaching for a tin of buttons that had slid behind it. He noticed, and he didn't say anything. He just put the book back. She noticed him noticing. On the third day, the storm broke. The silence that came in when the wind stopped was so profound that Samuel walked to the door and opened it, and just stood there looking at the white world outside with his mouth open. Nathaniel went for the large trunk that afternoon, alone, and came back with it before dark. He said nothing about it being difficult or the effort it required. He simply brought it and set it inside the door. Margaret had been rearranging the food supply to understand what they had and what they needed, and she had not let herself think about what happened next. She had promised herself 3 days ago she would figure it out, and now 3 days had passed and the storm was over and she still didn't have a clear answer, only the persistent, practical sense that the answer was here, in this place, in this man's underused homestead that was showing the strain of one person trying to maintain what two people had probably built. She would tell him, she decided. She would tell him plainly, the way she'd told him everything else. She was good at work. She had nowhere to go. This place had needs she could meet, and she would meet them fairly. She was still working out how to say it when Nathaniel came in from the barn that evening and sat down at the table and said, without preamble, "I've been thinking." "Yes?" she said. "You've got no way out of here until spring at the earliest, the way this winter's running." He looked at his hands. "And I've got more work than I can manage alone." He said this last part like it cost him something, which she suspected it did. "I noticed," she said. He looked up. "I wasn't saying that as a criticism," she said. "I was saying I noticed." She set down the tin she was holding. "I can work. I have worked. I'm not looking for permanent charity from a man who doesn't owe me anything. What I'm looking for is an arrangement that's fair to both of us." Nathaniel Cross looked at her for a long time. "You'd stay through winter," he said, "if you'll have us." He looked at Samuel, who was on the floor near the stove with a piece of string, doing something incomprehensible that seemed to absorb him completely. "He's a good boy," Nathaniel said. And then, as if embarrassed by the statement, he looked back at his hands. "All right," he said. "We'll try it." Margaret exhaled. Outside, the cold was still enormous, and the land was still strange, and the money in her coat pocket was still almost gone, and the man who had brought her here had done it with malice so complete it hadn't even needed to speak. But the fire was going, the roof was holding, her son was warm. She thought, all right, we'll try it. She was beginning to understand what survival always looked like from the inside. Not triumph, not rescue, just one more decision that kept you moving forward into whatever came next. The arrangement lasted 3 days before the first real argument. It wasn't a dramatic argument. It didn't involve raised voices or slammed doors. It was the kind of argument that happens between two people who are both certain they're right and have no established language for telling the other one. So, a low, compressed collision that left both of them standing in the barn, in the cold, pretending to look at separate things. What happened was this. Margaret had gotten up before Nathaniel for the 4th morning in a row and fed the horses before he came out. She had also moved the hay bales he'd stacked against the west wall to the south wall, because the west wall had a gap in the board siding that let in wind, and wet hay turned to useless hay, and she'd seen it as a problem that needed solving and solved it. Nathaniel walked into the barn, stopped, looked at the bales, and didn't say anything for a long moment. "The west wall has a draft," Margaret said. "I know it does." "The hay was getting damp." "I know that too." He walked to the south wall and looked at the new arrangement with the careful, neutral expression of a man measuring his words. "I was going to patch the siding this week." "Oh," she paused. "I didn't know that." "No," he said. "You didn't." She could have apologized and left it there. She almost did. Instead, she said, "It still needed moving in the meantime." He looked at her. "In the meantime," he repeated, "the patch isn't done yet. The hay was sitting in the draft." "Mrs. Ellison." He said her name with a particular evenness that communicated a great deal without saying it. "This is my barn." Yes, she said. And those are your horses and that's your hay. And if it had rotted in that corner, you'd have been short feed before March. They looked at each other. I would have gotten to it, he said. I know you would have. She picked up the feed bucket she'd come in for. I got to it first, that's all. He didn't answer. She went back to the cabin. An hour later, he came in for breakfast and sat down and ate what she'd made. Salt pork and the last of the cornmeal, stretched further than it wanted to go. And when he was done, he said, the feed store in Mill Haven opens twice a week in winter. I'm going Thursday. I need a list of what we're short on. She gave him the list without comment. He copied it onto a separate piece of paper in his careful, unhurried handwriting, folded it, put it in his coat pocket. She noticed he'd included 2 items she hadn't put on the list, a pound of dried beans and a paper of sewing needles. She had mentioned the needles, almost in passing, 4 days ago. She hadn't thought he'd been listening. That was the other thing about Nathaniel Cross. He listened to almost everything and said about a quarter of what he heard. Mill Haven was the nearest town. Not a large town, not a prosperous one, just the particular kind of frontier settlement that grows up where roads intersect and stays alive because people need somewhere to bring their problems. It had a general store, a livery, a doctor who was also the barber, a small hotel that mostly served traveling salesmen and the occasional lost party of settlers, and a population that had opinions about everything and time to discuss them. Margaret went with Nathaniel on Thursday, not because she needed to, but because she thought it was important to be seen, to establish herself as a person in this place, rather than something that had washed up on Nathaniel Cross's property and was of uncertain status. She understood, without anyone having to explain it, that in small communities and difficult country, reputation moved faster than weather. She was right about that. She was in the general store looking at fabric prices when she heard it. 2 women behind the calico bolts, not troubling themselves to lower their voices particularly. That's her, the widow Hare left out in the storm. Didn't he leave her? His man did. Same thing, isn't it? She came out here expecting a husband and got abandoned in the middle of a blizzard. Now she's at Nathaniel Cross's place. A pause, weighted with everything the pause was meant to carry. Alone out there with him? With her boy. Still, Margaret kept looking at the fabric prices. The fabric was too expensive for what she could afford, and this was useful to know, so she went on learning it. I don't see what she expected, the first woman said. Coming all the way out here on a letter. Didn't even meet the man first. Desperation makes people foolish. Margaret turned around. She did it deliberately, without hurry, because doing it with hurry would give those women something more interesting than the thing they already had. Good morning, she said. She smiled pleasantly at the woman nearest her, a tall woman in her 40s with iron-colored hair and an expression that recalibrated rapidly from candid to guarded. I'm Margaret Ellison. I believe you know who I am, the woman said after a beat. Clara Meacham, and with slightly less enthusiasm nodded at her companion. Ruth Dowd. Lovely to meet you both. Margaret looked at the calico. Do either of you know if Mr. Garfield orders this blue in a heavier weight? My son needs a winter shirt and this doesn't have quite enough body for the job. There was a small silence while both women worked out how to respond to being treated normally. He orders from the Denver catalog, Ruth Dowd said finally. You'd have to ask him. Could be 6 weeks or more. Thank you. Margaret turned back to the bolt. I'll ask him. She bought what she'd come for, said a polite goodbye to Clara Meacham and Ruth Dowd, and went to find Nathaniel at the livery. He was loading grain sacks into the wagon bed. He looked at her face when she came around the corner and said, What happened? Nothing specific, I just met Mill Haven. She helped him with the grain sack he was lifting, taking the other end without asking. What do people know about Dalton Hare? Not as much as they think. He settled the sack and straightened. He's generous with the Chamber of Commerce and careful about his image. His mother's the one who manages the family, but she does it quietly. Do people know what he does? What happened to me? Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. They suspect, he said. But suspecting isn't the same as knowing, and knowing isn't the same as saying so. Margaret absorbed this. Is there a lawyer in Mill Haven? He looked at her more carefully. One, Thomas Brierly. He does land disputes mostly. Why? Because I was transported under false pretenses, Margaret said, and abandoned in dangerous conditions, and I'd like to understand what options a person has in a situation like that. She picked up her parcel. I'm not saying I'll do anything. I'm saying I'd like to know. Nathaniel stood there looking at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, a kind of recalibration, like he'd drawn a map of her in his head and just realized the scale was wrong. Brierley has an office on the main street, he said. We have time if you want to stop. Not today. I'll think on it first. He nodded and climbed up to the wagon seat. Margaret climbed up on her side, and Samuel wedged between them with a peppermint stick he'd gotten from somewhere. Nathaniel had handed it to him without ceremony when they'd stopped at the store, without looking at him, as if it were the most ordinary transaction in the world. She didn't comment on it. She just watched the road and let the horses move them home. January settled in like a tenant who didn't intend to leave. The cold became something you stopped noticing in the large sense and only noticed in the specific. The way water in the wash basin skinned over before you could finish using it. The way the axe handle shocked your hands when the temperature went below a certain point. The way even the barn smelled differently at 20 below than it did at 10 below. Margaret learned the rhythms of the ranch, the way you learn any complex system, not by being taught, not all at once, but by watching and doing and making mistakes and adjusting. She made real mistakes. Not the tentative, self-correcting mistakes of someone being cautious, but the actual mistakes of someone trying hard at something unfamiliar. She misjudged the amount of water the milk cow needed, and the cow spent a day sullen and uncooperative. She let the fire in the stove burn too hot for the kind of slow cooking a bean soup requires, and scorched the bottom of the pot. She forgot, once, to latch the upper barn door properly, and the wind caught it in the night, and she woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of it banging and had to go out in the dark to fix it. Each time she handled it herself if she could, and told Nathaniel plainly if she couldn't. She noticed he never made her feel worse than the mistake already did. That was not nothing. She had been married to a decent man for 7 years, and she knew that not making someone feel worse than they already do is a form of consideration that not everyone thinks to practice. Samuel, for his part, made himself useful in the way children make themselves useful on frontier properties, unpredictably but meaningfully, in the specific gaps between adult tasks. He carried things. He watched things. He reported the location of items that adults misplaced, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent enough time watching adults misplace things to have developed a reliable tracking system. He became attached to the milk cow in a way that turned out to be practically useful, because the cow was also somewhat attached to Samuel and cooperated better when he was present. Nathaniel watched the boy with the careful attention of a man who doesn't want to be caught watching, which meant Margaret caught him at it regularly. She didn't say anything. She had learned that direct acknowledgement of Nathaniel's feelings tended to make him seal them off with the speed and efficiency of a man caulking a window against winter. What she noticed was the way he explained things to Samuel, not talking down, not the simplified, impatient shorthand some adults used with children. He just explained how things worked, how you checked the horse's hooves, how you read weather by the way clouds formed over the mountain ridge to the northwest, how you tested ice thickness before you crossed it, the way you'd explain to someone you expected to remember and use what you told them. Samuel remembered and used every bit of it. One evening in late January, Nathaniel came in from the barn with a problem. One of the fence posts on the north pasture line had heaved up in the freeze and the wire had gone slack, and he'd need to spend a day resetting it before any melt came and made a real mess. He said this to the air in front of him, not particularly to Margaret, the way he'd gotten into the habit of saying the next day's needs out loud, as he went through the evening's accounting of what had and hadn't gotten done. "I can help with that," Margaret said. He looked at her. "I've set fence posts," she said, "in Ohio. My father-in-law had 30 acres and it wasn't fancy, but I know how the work goes. Ground's harder here than Ohio. Then it'll take longer. I can still help." He thought about it. She could see him thinking about it, turning over whatever reservation he had, examining it, deciding how much weight to give it. "We'd have to take Samuel," he said. "He can manage. It's a full day's work and it'll be cold." "Nathaniel." She looked at him steadily. "He's not a fragile child. He survived 3 hours in a blizzard with nothing but me and a wagon canvas. He can manage a day's fencing." Nathaniel Cross looked at her for a long moment, and then, very slightly, the resistance went out of him, just in his shoulders, just an inch. "All right," he said. "We leave at first light." They worked the fence the next day, all 3 of them, with the temperature at 12 above, and the wind intermittently cutting and the ground exactly as hard as Nathaniel had said. Samuel worked the iron bar on the ground when he had enough weight to matter, and carried tools when he didn't. Margaret held posts and hammered staples and pulled wire with the steady, unremarkable competence of someone who is doing something physical and difficult and simply doing it, not performing it or managing it. At noon they stopped and ate the provisions she'd packed: cold biscuits, hard cheese, dried apricots. And Samuel fell asleep sitting up against Nathaniel's saddlebag, with a biscuit half-eaten in his hand, and Nathaniel looked at the sleeping boy and then out at the fence line they still had to finish. "You were right," he said. "He managed." "He usually does," Margaret said, "when you expect him to." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the dry grass. Somewhere to the north, something moved in the scrub and then went still. "His father," Nathaniel said. "What was he like?" She considered the question. Peter had been dead for almost a year, and she had not spoken about him to anyone since leaving Ohio, and she was surprised to find the question felt bearable now in a way it hadn't even 3 months ago. "Steady," she said. "Patient, not complicated." She looked at Samuel's sleeping face. He never raised his voice, not once in 7 years. Some people think that means a man doesn't feel things strongly, but I don't think that's what it meant with Peter. I think it meant he felt them and chose what to do with them. She paused. Samuel has that. The steadiness. Nathaniel didn't say anything. He ate a piece of cheese and looked at the fence. "Did you have a family?" Margaret asked. It was the first personal question she'd asked him that went beyond the practical. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "A wife," he said. "Eliza. 8 years ago. She died in childbed. The child also." Margaret didn't say she was sorry. It seemed inadequate to what that sentence contained. She said, "I didn't know." "No reason you would. Is that why you came out here? Afterward?" He looked at the fence line. "I was already here. We both were. This was supposed to be our place." He stopped. She picked the location, said she wanted to be able to see the mountains from the kitchen. Margaret looked at the cabin. The kitchen window did, in fact, face the mountains. "She was right about the view," Margaret said. Nathaniel looked at her. Something passed through his face that she couldn't name. Not pain exactly, not any single thing, more like several things moving through the same space in close succession. "Yeah," he said. "She was." They finished the fence that afternoon. They got back to the cabin in the last gray light before dark, and Samuel woke up slung over Nathaniel's shoulder where he'd been carried the last quarter mile, boneless with deep child sleep, and didn't fully rouse until Nathaniel set him down beside the stove. "Did we finish it?" Samuel asked, still half asleep. "We finished it," Nathaniel said. Samuel nodded seriously and lay back down on the cot, and was asleep again before either adult could say another word. February brought the real test of the arrangement. Not a dramatic test, not one clean crisis, just the accumulated weight of 2 months of close quarters in a small space. 2 adults with different histories and different methods, and no particular reason to trust each other, except the fact that they'd already been trusting each other, and it had more or less worked so far. Nathaniel was a man of habits, and his habits had been built for solitude. He needed silence in the mornings. He kept his few personal items in arrangements that had specific meaning to him, and he noticed when they were moved even slightly. He had a way of managing the fire at night that Margaret considered inefficient, and he considered correct, and they had reached a wordless compromise in which she managed the morning fire, and he managed the evening one, and neither mentioned it. Margaret was a woman who solved problems as she encountered them, which sometimes looked to Nathaniel like impulsiveness. And she was learning to distinguish between the things that were actually his business and the things that were hers. It was a harder line than she'd expected. They were sharing a very small space, and everything affected everything else. What she hadn't expected was how much they could accomplish when they worked in the same direction. The root cellar had been dug years ago and never properly finished. The walls were bare earth, and they lost more in the freeze-thaw than Nathaniel liked. He'd been meaning to line it for 2 seasons. In the second week of February, during a stretch of weather too cold to do outside work, they lined it. 4 days of close, awkward labor in a space that was not quite big enough for 2 adults to move comfortably, with Samuel handed small tasks to keep him occupied and out from underfoot. By the end of the second day, they had developed a working method. By the end of the third, they didn't need to talk much to know what the other needed next. It was on the fourth day, working close together on the far wall, that Nathaniel said, without looking at her, "You're good at this." Margaret fitted a board against the wall and held it. At what specifically? At not wasting time. She considered the phrasing. Coming from Nathaniel Cross, she understood. This was a significant statement. "Thank you," she said. "It's not a compliment. It's an observation." "I know," she said. "I'm thanking you for the observation." He drove a nail. She held the board. "Why did you really come out here?" he said. Not unkindly, just plainly, in the way he asked things when he'd been thinking about them for a while. "I told you why." "You told me the circumstances. That's not the same as why." He examined the board, drove another nail. "You had options. A woman with your capability had options. You could have found work in Columbus. Teaching, maybe. Something." Margaret was quiet for a moment. He wasn't wrong about that. She had thought about teaching. She had thought about a lot of things. "Samuel needed more than work," she said finally. "He needed a future, a real one, not just surviving." She paused. "I thought a proper home, a man, land, something to build from. I thought that was worth the risk." "And now?" She looked around the root cellar they'd been building for 4 days. The boards were rough, and the light was bad, and her knees ached from the damp ground, and her hands had a blister on the left palm she'd been managing for 2 days. "I still think it was worth the risk," she said. "I just didn't know what it would look like." Nathaniel looked at her then. She looked back. "Neither did I," he said. And then he looked away and handed her the next board, and they kept working. Awesome. It was Clara Meacham who told her, on a Thursday in late February, when Margaret had made her second trip to Millhaven for supplies. She said it not unkindly. Clara Meacham was not a cruel woman, just a practical one who thought information was something to be distributed rather than hoarded. She found Margaret at the dry goods counter and said, with the directness of someone doing someone a favor, "Dalton Hare is being considered for the county land board." Margaret kept her eyes on the list in her hand. "Is he?" "His mother's been working on it for 6 months. There are 3 board seats and one of them has been vacant since August. If he gets it, he'll have authority over water rights disputes." Clara Meacham looked at her. "I thought you should know." Margaret understood the implication without needing it spelled out. Land and water in Pueblo County were what everything was actually about, and always had been. A man with 6,000 acres and a seat on the Water Rights Board was a man with the ability to make smaller operations like Nathaniel's extremely difficult. "Why are you telling me?" Margaret asked. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because Ruth Dowd's sister was one of the women he did the same thing to, 2 years ago. She didn't survive the night." Margaret looked at her. "The storm," Clara said. "She was younger than you. She had no child with her." She met Margaret's eyes. "He has never been called to account for any of it." Margaret walked out of the store with her purchases and stood in the cold street for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. She thought about what Nathaniel had said. Suspecting isn't the same as knowing, and knowing isn't the same as saying so. She thought about Thomas Brierly, the lawyer on the main street, and the conversation she'd been putting off for 6 weeks. She went and knocked on his door. He was a small, precise man in his 60s with a desk covered in papers that were arranged in a disorder that she suspected was more organized than it looked. He listened to her for 20 minutes without interrupting, which told her he was either very good at his work or very interested in what she had to say. Possibly both. When she finished, he said, "You have documentary evidence? The letters he sent you?" "Yes, all 4 of them. I kept everything." He looked at her steadily. "And the man Briggs who transported you, you could identify him?" "I could describe him well enough that anyone who knew him would identify him without difficulty." Brierly put his fingers together. "Mrs. Ellison, what you're describing has been done before. The challenge is not identifying what occurred. The challenge is proving that it was Hare's intent, and not simply a misunderstanding or a servant acting beyond his instructions." Briggs said, and I quote as precisely as I can remember, "Mr. Hare sends his apologies." Brierly looked at her for a long moment. "That is useful," he said quietly. "I know it is." She sat forward slightly. "I'm not asking you to file anything today. I'm asking you to tell me what evidence I would need, in what form, to make a case that couldn't be deflected as misunderstanding or rumor. I want to understand what I'm building before I build it. He studied her with the look of a man reassessing the situation he thought he was in. You're not frightened, he said. I'm frightened, she said. I'm just not letting it run the meeting. He almost smiled. He pulled a piece of paper toward him. All right, he said. Let's talk about what you'd need. She was at his office for an hour. When she came out, Nathaniel was waiting with the wagon, and he looked at her face and said nothing, just waited. I'll tell you on the way back, she said, and climbed up, and the horses moved them out of Millhaven and into the cold white land that had become, without her quite deciding it, something she was no longer trying to leave. The decision had happened the way most real decisions happen, not in a single moment of clarity, not dramatically, but in the accumulation of small moments that added up to a direction before she'd given it a name. She had stopped thinking of this place as temporary somewhere around the time she'd lined the root cellar. She had stopped thinking of Nathaniel Cross as a stranger somewhere around the time he'd told her about Eliza. What she had not yet done was say any of this out loud. And Nathaniel, who listened to almost everything and said about a quarter of what he heard, was looking at the road ahead with the careful, focused attention of a man who is also, underneath all that careful attention, waiting for something. Not sure what it is exactly, not sure when it will arrive, but waiting all the same. The horses moved through the cold afternoon light, and the mountains sat on the horizon exactly where Eliza Cross had wanted them to be. And Margaret held the list of what Thomas Brierly needed in her coat pocket, and felt the outline of something that was not quite a plan and not quite a decision, but was closer to both than anything she'd had since Ohio. She would need the letters. She would need Briggs. She would need patience and time, and the kind of steady daily persistence that doesn't look like much from the outside until suddenly it becomes unmistakable. She had all of those things. She'd been building them her whole life without knowing what she was building them for. Thomas Brierly had given her a list. It was not a long list, but it was a precise one, written in his small, careful hand on a half sheet of paper that Margaret had read so many times in the 3 weeks since her visit to his office that she could recite it without looking. Documentary evidence of the original correspondence. A witness to her arrival in Pueblo and her departure with Briggs. Testimony from any other woman who had been similarly treated, if such a woman could be found and would speak. And this was the difficult one. Some form of corroboration that Briggs had acted on Hare's explicit instruction and not of his own improvisation. That last item was the one that kept her awake. Briggs's parting words, "Mr. Hare sends his apologies," were something, but Brierly had been careful to explain that something was not the same as enough. A skilled lawyer on the other side, and Dalton Hare would have a skilled lawyer, could argue that Briggs had invented the line to soften the blow of his own decision, that he'd exceeded his instructions, that the apology was an unauthorized courtesy from a man who felt guilty about leaving a woman in the snow. It was a thin argument, but it was an argument, and thin arguments had defeated stronger cases in worse courts than Pueblo County. She turned the problem over the way you turn difficult ground, steadily, without expectation of finding it easy. March came in raw and uneven, the way Colorado March always did. A warm day that made you think the worst was finished, then 3 days of hard cold that reminded you it wasn't. The mud season began at the edges, the ground going soft in the afternoons and freezing again at night, making every task twice as difficult and everything that required hauling a negotiation with the terrain. Nathaniel was up on the barn roof on the first warm day, replacing 2 boards that had buckled under the winter's ice load. Margaret handed things up to him from below, and they worked with the comfortable efficiency they'd developed over 3 months. Not talking more than the work required, not needing to. Samuel was in the yard attempting to convince the milk cow to accept a rope halter, which the cow was declining with the patient stubbornness of an animal that had made this decision before and saw no reason to revisit it. She won't take it that way, Nathaniel said from the roof, without looking down. Samuel looked up. What way then? Loop it over her neck first. Let her wear it a while before you try the halter part. She's got to decide it's her idea. Samuel considered this philosophy and applied it. The cow stood still for the neck loop with the air of an animal tolerating something beneath her dignity. Margaret looked up at Nathaniel. He was looking at the boy and the cow with an expression he didn't know she was watching, and it was not the careful, sealed expression he used when he knew he was being observed. It was something quieter than that. She looked away before he could catch her at it. That afternoon, after Samuel was in bed and the cabin had settled into its evening quiet, Margaret told Nathaniel what Clara Meacham had told her. About the land board. About Hare's appointment, which was now apparently a matter of weeks away rather than months. About Ruth Dowd's sister. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she thought he was deciding how to be careful with what he said next. She'd learned to distinguish between his silences. The ones that meant he was annoyed, the ones that meant he was thinking, and the ones that meant he was keeping something back. This was the last kind. "What?" she said. He looked at the fire. "Hare's been buying up water access on the creek beds north of here," he said, quietly, "through a man named Aldous who fronts the purchases so they don't show as Hare's name in the county record. If he gets the board seat, he can use the authority to formalize those purchases in ways that cut off smaller operations from upstream access." He paused. "Mine is one of them." Margaret absorbed this. "How long have you known?" "Since December. A man named Pullman, who runs cattle on the adjoining section, told me when he started piecing it together. He's been trying to get people to listen, but without a formal complaint or documented evidence, there's nothing to bring to anyone official. And you didn't tell me. It wasn't your problem." She looked at him steadily. "Nathaniel, we have been living in the same house for 3 months. When something threatens this property, it is my problem." He met her eyes. "You are already dealing with enough. That's not your decision to make about me." The fire between them. He didn't argue the point, which she took as acknowledgement. "Pullman," she said, "would he talk to Brierly?" "Probably. He's been wanting to talk to someone for 2 months." "Then we should introduce them." She thought for a moment. "Brierly is building a case around what Hare did to me and to the other women. But if we can show a pattern that what he does to women is the same thing he does to small landowners, that it's not personal carelessness but systematic, that changes what we're looking at." Nathaniel watched her. "That's a different kind of case," he said. "Yes," she said. "It's a better one." She could see him recalculating. He was a man who solved problems the way he built things, methodically, one piece at a time, in the order that made structural sense. She was asking him to hold more of the structure in his head at once than he was accustomed to. "You've been thinking about this since February," he said. Not accusatory, just recognizing the shape of something. "Since the day Briggs rode away," she said. "I've just been learning what I needed to know before I could do anything useful with the thinking." He looked at the fire for a long time. "All right," he said. "I'll ride out to Pullman's tomorrow." She met Dalton Hare for the first time on a Tuesday in late March. It was not planned. She was in Mill Haven at the dry goods counter when he came in, and she knew him before she was told who he was. Not from the photograph, which had been stiff and formal and hadn't captured the man in motion, but from the way the room arranged itself around him. People made space. Not from fear, not exactly. From the particular social instinct that operates around men who have money and haven't had to moderate themselves in long enough that the habit of being accommodated has become part of their bearing. He was taller than the photograph suggested, well-dressed for the county, not extravagantly, but with the kind of care that signals resources. He had his mother's eyes, or so Clara Meacham had told her once, which was a thing Clara had said with enough meaning behind it that Margaret had filed it without asking for clarification. He didn't recognize her. That was, in its way, the most complete statement about the situation she could have received. He was talking to Garfield, the store owner, about a supply order, and Margaret stood 8 feet away at the counter and finished her purchase and gathered her parcels, and was almost to the door when he turned and his gaze passed over her and stopped. She watched him work it out. She could see it happening, some signal from memory or description arriving a beat after his eyes had already moved past her, pulling his attention back, making him look again. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. She stopped. She turned around. "Mr. Hare," she said. There were other people in the store. Garfield behind the counter. A woman Margaret didn't know looking at bolts of wool near the window. The moment had witnesses, which Margaret noted. Dalton Hare crossed the distance between them with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never had to wonder whether he would be received. "I'm glad I've run into you," he said. "I've been meaning to. I owe you an explanation." "Yes," Margaret said. "You do." He registered the flatness of her tone and paused. Something moved through his expression. Not guilt, she thought, or not only guilt, more like a man performing contrition because he'd worked out that it was the position that served him best. What happened was unconscionable, he said, with the air of someone reading from a script he believed in. Briggs exceeded his instructions. I want you to understand that. He was told to explain that circumstances had changed and to arrange return transport for you and your boy. What he actually did was entirely his own action, and I've dealt with him accordingly. Margaret looked at him. She thought about Brierly's list. She thought about the thin argument on the other side. She thought about Ruth Dowd's sister, who had not survived the night. Is that what happened? She said. I assure you. Because what I remember, she said calmly and at a volume sufficient for the room, is a man named Briggs telling me that Mr. Hare sends his apologies while he rode away and left my 6-year-old son in a blizzard. She held the parcels against her chest. I remember that quite precisely. The other people in the room had gone very still. Hare's expression didn't break, but something behind it shifted. A recalibration. He had come into this with a plan, and the plan had assumed a particular kind of woman, shaken, perhaps desperate, certainly grateful for the acknowledgement, and she was none of those things. Mrs. Ellison, he said, lower, with an intimacy that was meant to be disarming. I would like to make this right. Whatever you need to be settled in this territory. I have resources and I have connections, and I would be glad to use them on your behalf, in recognition of what went wrong. She looked at him for a moment. I know about the water rights, she said. The room was so still she could hear the stove ticking. Dalton Hare looked at her. I don't know what you... Aldous, she said. Creek access north of Hare property, filed through a front name so it doesn't appear in your records. I imagine Mr. Brierly would find the documentation interesting reading. For the first time, something appeared in Hare's face that was not performance. It was brief, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness that was different from the composed stillness he'd walked in with. You should be careful, he said. Quiet. Not a threat exactly, but the shape of one. I am careful, Margaret said. I'm very careful. I've been building the habit for months. She picked up her parcels more firmly. Good day, Mr. Hare. She walked out. She stood in the cold street outside and her hands were shaking slightly inside her gloves. Not from fear, but from the aftermath of sustained control, the way your body releases what you held in once the moment is over. She breathed through it for 30 seconds and then went to find Nathaniel. He was at the livery, and he looked at her face again the way he always looked at her face when she came out of something. Hare, she said. I saw him go in. He watched her. You're all right? I'm fine. I may have moved things faster than Brierly intended. She told him what she'd said, all of it, in order. When she finished, Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. The water rights, he said. You told him we knew. Yes. Before Brierly has a case filed. Yes. He considered this. She could see him deciding whether it was a problem. He'll move to protect himself now, Nathaniel said, or he'll make a mistake. She looked up the street toward Brierly's office. Frightened men make different decisions than comfortable ones. I'd rather him frightened than comfortable while we build the case quietly. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. That's a gamble, he said. Most things are. He looked at the street. I'm going to talk to Pullman this afternoon. Come with me. Pullman's operation was 12 miles northeast, a modest spread, well-managed, running about 200 head on creek-fed pasture. He was a compact, wind-burned man in his late 40s named Walt, with a wife named Helen who brought them coffee without being asked and stayed in the room, which Margaret appreciated because it meant Helen had opinions worth hearing. Walt Pullman spread a hand-drawn map on his kitchen table and showed them what he'd pieced together. 6 water access points on the Northern Creek system, purchased over 18 months through a man named Gerald Aldous, who operated out of Denver and whose connection to Dalton Hare was a matter of Walt's careful research, and a conversation with a freighter who'd seen Aldous meeting Hare twice in Pueblo. It's not the kind of evidence a court wants, Walt said. No, Margaret said, but it's the kind a lawyer can build from. She looked at the map. How many other operations does this affect? Potentially 6, maybe 7, depending on which way the board rules on upstream priority claims. He looked at Nathaniel. You'd be among the worst affected. Your north pasture is entirely dependent on seasonal creek flow. I know, Nathaniel said. Helen Pullman, who had been sitting against the wall with her coffee, said, "There's a woman in town named Dorothea Marsh. Came out here 2 years ago from Missouri. She went through the same thing yours did." She looked at Margaret without embarrassment. Hare's people dropped her at the Kavanaugh Road. She made it to the Weber farm. She's been working at the hotel in Millhaven since then. Margaret looked at her. "Has she talked to anyone about it?" "She doesn't talk about it at all," Helen said. "But she remembers. You can see it. Would she talk to me?" Helen considered. "She might. She won't talk to a man about it. She won't talk to anyone in an official capacity. But another woman who went through the same thing," she looked at her coffee, "she might." That evening, riding back in the last pale light, Margaret told Nathaniel what she was thinking. That the case needed to be two things simultaneously: the water rights fraud for the land board appointment and the documented pattern of what happened to the women, because both pointed to the same truth, that Dalton Hare operated on the belief that certain people were disposable, that consequences did not attach to him, that the distance between what he wanted and what was acceptable was simply a matter of having enough power to make other people absorb the cost. "And Brierly can make that argument?" Nathaniel said. "Brierly is more interested than he was 3 weeks ago," Margaret said. "He told me when I went back this week that he'd had a conversation with the county clerk about the land board appointment, that there are procedural requirements for the appointment that Hare may not have fully satisfied." Nathaniel looked at the road. "You went back to Brierly this week?" "Tuesday." He was quiet. "You've been managing a lot of this without saying so," he said. "I didn't want to bring you a problem until I had something useful to bring along with it." "That's what I mean," he said. "You don't have to do it that way." She looked at him. The horses moved through the long blue dusk. "What way?" she said. "Alone." He said it simply, without drama, looking at the road. "You've been doing every piece of it alone. The letters, Brierly, Meacham, Pullman. Like you're still in this by yourself." The weight of the sentence landed differently than she expected. "I'm used to it," she said. "I know you are." He looked over at her briefly. "You don't have to be." She looked at the road. "All right," she said. That was all she said. But she meant it as the thing it was. Not agreement about a practical arrangement, not a statement about the legal case, but something smaller and more exact than either. The acknowledgement that she had been holding herself apart from him in the specific way that people hold themselves apart from things that matter to them, because things that matter can be taken. They rode the rest of the way home without speaking. She went to find Dorothea Marsh on a Thursday morning alone, without telling Nathaniel where she was going, because she wanted to get there first and understand what she was dealing with before she brought anyone else into it. The hotel in Millhaven was a narrow 2-story building that smelled of old wood and boiled laundry. Dorothea Marsh was in the kitchen, which was where the woman at the front desk said she'd be, and where she was a small woman in her 30s, dark-haired, with the particular quality that people carry when they have gone through something serious and come out the other side not destroyed but fundamentally altered, the way wood is altered by fire. Still functional, but changed in grain. She looked at Margaret when Margaret introduced herself, and something happened in her face that was very quiet and very complex. "I heard you were at Cross's place," Dorothea said. She didn't say it with judgment. She said it as information. "Yes." Margaret sat down across from her at the work table without being invited, because she thought being invited would not happen, and waiting for it would close the door. "I know what happened to you, not the details, the general shape of it." Dorothea was peeling potatoes. She went on peeling them. "What do you want?" she said. "I want to know if you kept the letters he sent you." Dorothea's hand stopped. "Because I kept mine," Margaret said. 4 letters. His handwriting, his name, promises that are specific enough to constitute a legal claim of fraudulent inducement if there's a lawyer willing to make that argument. She paused. "Thomas Brierly is willing to make that argument, but it's a stronger case if it isn't only me." Dorothea looked at her for a long time. Outside the kitchen window, the main street went about its Thursday business. A wagon passing, a dog bark, someone calling across to someone else about something Margaret couldn't make out. "I have 3 letters," Dorothea said. "I kept them because I couldn't figure out if I was going to need them or going to burn them." "Don't burn them," Margaret said. Dorothea looked down at the potato in her hand. "He's going to be on the land board," she said. "I've heard people talking about it. Another 6 months, and it won't matter what letters I have. That's why we're doing it now, Margaret said, before the appointment is confirmed. Brierly says there's a review period, 30 days from the formal nomination, during which objections can be filed with the county clerk. The nomination was filed 2 weeks ago. Dorothea's head came up. That's 2 weeks left, she said. Yes. Margaret looked at her steadily. I know you didn't come here to fight anyone. I know you came here to get away from it and build something quiet. I'm not asking you to want what I want. She paused. I'm asking you to think about the next woman, because there will be one. There always has been. This kitchen was quiet. Dorothea set the potato down. She dried her hands on her apron with the slow deliberateness of someone making up their mind about something and giving the decision the time it deserved. I'll talk to Brierly, she said. I'm not promising anything beyond that. That's all I'm asking, Margaret said. She walked out of the hotel and stood in the March street with the thin spring light falling on her shoulders and felt something she hadn't felt since Ohio. Not relief, not safety, not any of the soft things. Something more like the feeling you get when you've been pushing against a door for a long time and it finally begins to move. Not open, just move. She went to Brierly's office. He was there. He looked up when she came in, and she sat down across from his paper-covered desk and said, Dorothea Marsh will talk to you. She has 3 letters. You have 2 weeks before the review period closes. Brierly looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man reassessing how seriously he should have been taking this situation all along. Pullman has the water rights documentation, she continued. He has a witness to Aldous meeting with Hare in Pueblo. It's circumstantial, but it's a starting point. She folded her hands on her knees. What do you need me to do? He looked at her for another moment. Then he pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him and picked up his pen. Start from the beginning, he said. Everything he wrote, everything Briggs said, as much detail as you can give me. So she started from the beginning. She told it all again the same way she'd been telling it to herself for 4 months. Not with dramatics, not with sentiment, but in the flat, precise voice of someone who has decided that truth is most useful when it's delivered clean. Outside, Millhaven went about its business. Somewhere across town, in a hotel kitchen, Dorothea Marsh was looking at 3 letters she'd almost burned. 12 miles northeast, Walt Pullman had a hand-drawn map, and a freighter's account, and a frustration he'd been carrying since the previous fall. On the Cross Ranch, Nathaniel was doing the afternoon feeding, and Samuel was probably somewhere nearby, doing whatever 7-year-old boys do in the first uncertain days of a Colorado spring, finding the edges of the world and testing them. The case was not made yet. It might not be enough. Brierly had not promised her it would work, only that it was worth attempting, and there was a meaningful difference between those 2 things. But she was not the woman who had stood in the road calling after Briggs anymore. She was not the woman who had arrived at Nathaniel's cabin with $12 and a plan that had dissolved around her. She was something other than that now, built from the specific materials of 4 months on difficult ground, not harder, not softer, just more exactly herself than she'd been before any of this happened. Whatever Dalton Hare had intended when he sent Briggs out with a borrowed horse and a borrowed apology, he had not intended this. He had intended to dispose of a problem. He had created, instead, the person most precisely positioned to become one. Brierly wrote steadily. Margaret talked. The afternoon light moved across the office floor in the unhurried way of March light, which has all the time in the world. Brierly filed the objection on a Wednesday, 11 days before the review period closed. He did not tell Margaret he was going to file on that particular day. He sent a message to the ranch with a boy from town, a folded note that said only, "Filed this morning. We wait now. B." She read it at the kitchen table while Nathaniel stood at the stove and Samuel was outside somewhere in the muddy yard doing something she could hear but not see, and she put the note down on the table and sat with it for a moment. Brierly filed, she said. Nathaniel turned from the stove. He looked at the note, then at her face. How do you feel? He said. It was not the kind of question he asked habitually, and the fact that he asked it now meant he understood that this was the kind of moment where the answer was not obvious. Like I've thrown a stone in a pond, she said, and now I wait to see what the water does. He turned back to the stove. Hare will respond. Yes. His lawyer will be better paid than Brierly. Yes. She looked at the note. But Brierly has the letters, and Dorothea, and Pullman's documentation, and the clerk's procedural question about the appointment. She folded the note once. A well-paid lawyer is useful when the facts are thin. When the facts are not thin, it's a different kind of fight. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then, "You sound like you've been talking to Brierly." "I've been talking to Brierly twice a week for 3 weeks." He looked over his shoulder at her. There was something in his expression that was not quite concern and not quite admiration, something that sat between them, unclassified. "All right," he said. He put a bowl of stew on the table in front of her. "Eat something." She almost said something about the fact that he'd made dinner, which he did not often do. She didn't. She just picked up the spoon. The response came from Hare's lawyer 8 days later, and it was what Brierly had predicted, and worse. The lawyer's name was Harlan Goss, and he had an office in Denver and a reputation in Pueblo County as the kind of man who made legal proceedings feel like weather. Not a human action, but a natural force that simply happened to people and against which argument was futile. He had represented Hare's family in 3 land disputes over the past decade, and he had won all 3. And he had won them not by being cleverer than the opposing counsel, but by making the opposing counsel feel that continuing was not worth the cost. His response to the objection was 40 pages. Brierly showed it to Margaret on a Friday afternoon with the expression of a man who is choosing his words carefully. "He's not arguing the facts," Brierly said. "He's arguing the standing. He says your claim of fraudulent inducement doesn't rise to the level of legal injury sufficient to constitute grounds for blocking a public appointment, because the appointment itself has no direct bearing on a private matter between you and Mr. Hare." "That's not what I filed on," Margaret said. "No, you filed on both, the private matter and the water rights. He's separating them. He says the water rights documentation is circumstantial and speculative, and the purchases are legal on their face regardless of whose interests they serve." Brierly set the papers down. "He's not wrong that it's circumstantial. He's also not wrong that a private dispute doesn't automatically invalidate a public appointment." Margaret looked at the stack of papers. "What does he say about Dorothea?" Brierly's expression did something careful. "He says her account is uncorroborated and that the letters she has, while similar in style to yours, prove only that Mr. Hare engaged in correspondence with multiple women, not that he intended harm to any of them." "He left her at a crossroads in November," Margaret said, "without transport, without resources. He says that was Briggs acting without authorization." "He said that about me too." "Yes." Brierly looked at his hands. "He's going to keep saying it. That's the strategy. Put everything on Briggs, who has since left the territory and cannot be located for questioning." Margaret sat very still. Briggs. She had thought about him and not thought about him, filed him as a variable she couldn't control, and tried not to give him more space than that. Now he was the center of everything. "Can he be found?" she said. "I have someone asking questions," Brierly said. "But Colorado is large and people who leave quickly can be difficult to locate." "What about the man Hare dismissed him? Presumably that was witnessed." Brierly looked at her. "Where did you get that?" "Hare told me himself, in the store, in front of witnesses, in March. He said he dealt with Briggs accordingly." "Dealt with." That's a specific word for a man trying to position this as Briggs acting alone. It implies knowledge of what Briggs did and a judgment made in response. Brierly was very still for a moment. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her with increasing frequency, with the expression of a man updating a prior estimate. "Garfield was in the store," she said, "and a woman I didn't know." And Hare said it in a voice that carried. He was trying to seem accountable. He didn't think about what accountability implies. Brierly reached for a pen. "I'll need a full account of that conversation." "I already wrote it down. The night it happened, while I could still hear it exactly." She took a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket and set it on his desk. "I kept the habit from your list." He unfolded it. He read it. He set it down and looked at her across the desk with an expression that had moved past professional assessment into something more personal. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, "I want to be honest with you about where this stands." "Please." "Goss is going to push back hard on everything we file. The appointment review is in 6 days, and I can request an extension on procedural grounds, which may or may not be granted. The private case against Hare is going to take months, possibly a year or more, and the outcome is not certain." He paused. "What I can tell you with more confidence is that the conversation you had in Garfield's store, properly documented and supported by witness testimony from Garfield himself, is the strongest single piece of evidence we have. It's not Hare ordering Briggs directly. but it's Hare acknowledging that Briggs acted and that he responded, which cuts directly against the idea that he had no knowledge or involvement. Can you get Garfield to testify to it? I can ask him. Whether he will depends on how frightened he is of Hare's business. He's not frightened, Margaret said. He doesn't like Hare. He never has. You can hear it in the way he says the man's name, like something that tastes wrong. She thought for a moment. Let me talk to him first, before you go with official questions. Let me have a conversation. Brierly looked at her. You're very good at conversations, he said. I've had to be, she said. I didn't come to this county with much else. She talked to Garfield the following Monday. He was a heavy-set man of 60 with a careful approach to the world and a general store that he'd been running for 19 years and intended to run for another 19, which meant he thought about consequences before he acted on things. He listened to Margaret with his hands flat on the counter and his eyes steady on her face, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You're asking me to testify in a legal proceeding, he said. I'm asking you to tell the truth about what you heard, she said, which is what you'd be doing. Those two things don't always feel different. I know. She met his eyes. I'm not asking you to take a side. I'm asking you to report what happened in your own store, in front of you, between two people. That's not taking a side. That's being a witness to your own life. He looked at his hands. Hare spends money in this store, he said. Not as much as people think because his operation orders a lot through Denver, but some. And his people spend more. Yes. She didn't minimize it. That's a real cost. I'm not pretending it isn't. And what do I get for carrying it? She thought about how to answer that because it was a fair question and deserved a fair answer. A county where the man running water rights is someone other than Dalton Hare, she said, which, given what he's been doing to the creek access north of town, has a direct bearing on a lot of operations that also spend money in your store. She paused. And the knowledge that a woman and her child are still alive because someone told the truth. Garfield looked at her for a long time. I'll talk to Brierly, he said. I'm not promising more than that. That's all I've asked anyone, she said. She was almost to the door when he said, Mrs. Ellison. She turned. He said it loud, Garfield said. Hare did, in the store, like he was announcing something. I always thought that was odd. A man trying to distance himself from something usually speaks quieter, not louder. He paused. I've thought about it since. What do you think it means? She said. I think he was trying to convince himself as much as you. He looked at his counter. Men like that often are. She walked out into the April street mob. Because it was April now, had turned April somewhere in the middle of everything, the mud deepening and then drying, and the first actual warmth arriving in the afternoons, tentative but real, and stood for a moment in the thin spring light. 6 days to the appointment review. Brierly had the Garfield conversation. He had the note Margaret had written the night of March, every word of Hare's reproduced as precisely as she could manage. He had Dorothea's letters, and Margaret's letters, and Pullman's map, and the freighter's account of Aldous meeting Hare in Pueblo. He had requested the extension on procedural grounds, and the clerk had granted 7 additional days, which meant they had 13 days total, and Goss would spend every one of them making the air around the case as difficult to breathe as possible. She went back to the ranch and told Nathaniel all of it. He listened in the way he'd been listening for weeks now, not as a bystander, not as someone managing from a remove, but fully present, asking questions when he had them, which was more often than he used to. Garfield will testify, he said. He'll talk to Brierly, which I think means yes. And the extension was granted. 13 more days. He nodded slowly. I was at the table with a piece of tack he'd been mending, and he set it down. I went to see Pullman yesterday, he said. She looked at him. 2 of the other operations that would be affected by the water rights, Ben Alderman south of Pullman's place, and a man named Crowder who runs sheep on the Flat Creek Road. They're willing to file a separate objection about the water access purchases, not as part of your case, as a land use complaint to the county commissioner. He paused. Brierly thinks it helps. 2 separate lines of complaint make it harder to dismiss either one as a personal grievance. She looked at him. When did you talk to Brierly? She said. Thursday. He picked up the tack again. While you were at Dorothea's, I thought... He stopped. I thought it shouldn't be only you carrying the legal end of it. She remembered what she'd said to him in the barn in January. This is my barn. She remembered what he'd said to her in February, riding home in the dark. You don't have to be alone. She had said all right and meant it, and was still learning what it looked like in practice. Thank you, she said. He didn't look up from the tack. Don't thank me. It's my creek access too. She smiled just slightly, and he didn't see it because he was looking at his work, which was fine. It was enough to feel it without managing it. The gathering at the Meacham Ranch happened on a Saturday in mid-April, and Margaret had not known she was going to it until Thursday, when Clara Meacham appeared at the ranch gate in a wagon and told her that a group of the landowners and their families from the county would be meeting to discuss the situation formally, and that Margaret and Nathaniel should come. Is this about the water rights? Margaret asked. It's about several things, Clara said. Hare has been putting his own version of events around, and people need to hear the other version from someone who can speak to it directly. She looked at Margaret without sentiment. That someone is you. The Meacham Ranch was 12 miles west, a larger operation than Nathaniel's, with a main house that had a proper parlor and enough room to seat 20 people without significant discomfort. By the time Margaret and Nathaniel arrived on Saturday afternoon, Samuel left with Helen Pullman, who had offered without being asked. There were already 16 people inside, ranchers and their wives. A couple of men Margaret didn't recognize, but who had the look of people who dealt in land and legal matters and had traveled some distance to be present. Dalton Hare was there. Margaret saw him from across the room when she came in, and his eyes found her at the same time, and there was a half-second between them that contained everything. The blizzard, the road, Briggs riding east, Brierly's office, the store conversation, all of it compressed into the space between two people who understand what they are to each other. He was with his mother. This was the first time Margaret had seen Adeline Hare, and she understood immediately and completely what Clara Meacham had meant when she said she had her son's eyes. Adeline was 70 or close to it, straight-backed, and composed with the specific composure of someone who has never had to develop uncertainty about their position in a room. She wore black, which was not mourning. Her husband had been dead for 15 years, but authority. She looked at Margaret with the flat, measuring gaze of a woman who has assessed many people quickly and found most of them manageable. She was looking at Margaret the way she looked at people she was determining how to manage. Margaret looked back. It was Harlan Goss, she realized, who had come with them, standing slightly behind Adeline with the watchful positioning of a man whose presence is meant to communicate something about the resources available to his employer. James Meacham, Clara's husband, organized the room with the businesslike efficiency of a man who has run meetings before and doesn't believe in letting them drift. He laid out the situation in broad terms: the land board appointment, the objections filed, the water rights questions, the procedural review period that had been extended and was now 6 days from closing. He was scrupulously neutral in his framing, which Margaret appreciated because it meant everyone in the room was working from the same set of facts before they began arguing. Goss spoke first, which she expected. He was good at it. Not theatrical, not aggressive, but authoritative in the way of someone who has been paid to be right in rooms like this and has the track record to make that payment feel reasonable. He said the objections filed against the appointment were a private grievance dressed as a public matter, that the water rights purchases were lawful and documented, and the accusation of proxy buying was unsubstantiated, that the county would benefit from Hare's experience and resources on the land board, and that blocking the appointment would set a precedent for allowing personal disputes to interfere with public governance. It was a good argument. Margaret listened to it carefully and noted where it was strong and where it relied on the room-accepting premises that had not been established. When Goss finished, Meacham looked at Brierly, who had come with Margaret and Nathaniel and had been sitting quietly in the corner with his papers. Brierly stood up. He was not as polished as Goss, and he knew it, and he had decided his answer to that fact was to be more precise. He laid out what the objection actually said, not paraphrase, the actual language. And then he read, verbatim, one of Hare's letters to Margaret. The third one. The one that was most specific about intent, about the arrangement, about what he was promising and to whom. The room was quiet while he read it. Then he read Hare's statement in Garfield's store, verbatim, from Margaret's written account, which Garfield had confirmed in every particular. Mr. Hare sends his apologies, and then, I've dealt with him accordingly. The first statement, Brierly said, comes from Mrs. Ellison's account, of what Briggs said when he abandoned her and her 6-year-old son in a blizzard. The second comes from Mr. Hare's own mouth, in front of witnesses, in a public establishment 2 months later. Together, they describe a man who knew what his employee did, exercised judgment about it afterward, and has since attempted to characterize it as an unauthorized act. Those two facts cannot both be true simultaneously. He paused, looking at no one in particular. The objection does not ask whether Mr. Hare is a capable administrator. It asks whether the county should appoint to a position of public authority a man who has demonstrated that he considers certain people disposable when they become inconvenient, and that he will manage the accounting of his own actions to avoid accountability. The pattern documented here is not a private matter. It is a record of how this man conducts himself when he believes consequences will not attach to him. That is precisely the thing a land board appointment requires us to evaluate. The room was quiet for a moment. Adeline Hare spoke. She spoke in a voice that had clearly commanded rooms for 50 years and did not expect to be interrupted. She said that the objection was the product of a resentful woman who had been disappointed in her expectations and was using legal process as a vehicle for personal grievance, and that the community would do well to consider the source before acting on claims that were designed to harm a family that had contributed to the county's growth for 30 years. It was the right argument for a different room. In this room, Margaret could feel the specific quality of silence that meant people were listening to a woman dismiss another woman and doing the arithmetic about what that meant. She stood up. She hadn't planned to. She had planned to let Brierly handle the room and speak only if directly addressed. But Adeline Hare had said resentful and disappointed and personal grievance, and the words landed in Margaret like 3 small fires, and she decided that the correct response to 3 small fires was not to let them burn unchecked. "Mrs. Hare," she said, her voice was level, "I came to this county in January with my son, who is 7 years old, on the basis of 4 letters written over 4 months in which your son described a home, a future, and a commitment. I traveled 11 days by rail with most of my available money. I arrived in Pueblo and was transported 12 miles east on a trail that led nowhere, and a man in your son's employ left me and my child on an open road in a blizzard without food, without shelter, and without explanation." She paused. "I am not here because I am disappointed. I am not here because I am resentful. I am here because what was done to me was done deliberately and has been done to other women, and the man who arranged it is now being considered for a position from which he could arrange similar treatment for landowners whose water access he finds inconvenient." She looked at the room rather than at Adeline. "I'm not asking anyone in this room to feel sorry for me. I'm asking you to look at the record of what a man does when he believes no one will hold him accountable, and to decide whether that is the man you want governing your water." The room was very still. Nathaniel was looking at her from across the room. He had the expression he wore when he'd recalibrated someone and was processing the new measurement. Dalton Hare said, "I've already explained that Briggs—" "I know what you've explained," Margaret said, looking at him directly. "You explained it to me in Garfield's store in March, in a voice that carried, in front of witnesses. You explained that you had dealt with him accordingly, which means you know what he did, which means you know what you authorized." She did not raise her voice. There was no need to raise her voice. "I have 4 letters in your handwriting. Dorothea Marsh has 3 more. We have 2 independent witnesses to your employee's account of his instructions. We have documentation of 12 months of proxy purchases of water access through Gerald Aldis." She looked at Goss. "This is not a thin case, Mr. Goss. I understand that your strategy has been to treat it as one. I'm telling you, in front of everyone in this room, that it is not." Goss looked at her with the particular professional respect of a man encountering a problem that has been better prepared than he was told to expect. Hare was very still. Adeline Hare was looking at her with an expression that had moved past the measuring assessment of earlier into something flatter and more serious. Not fear. Adeline Hare was not a woman who feared things easily, but recognition. The look of someone who has encountered the specific type of person they should have taken seriously earlier and is now adjusting. James Meacham said, "I think we've heard enough to have a discussion," and began managing the room back toward order, which gave Margaret the opportunity to sit down, which she did. Nathaniel leaned slightly toward her. He said very quietly, "You didn't tell me you were going to do that." "I didn't know I was going to do that," she said, equally quiet. He was quiet for a moment, then, "You were right to." The discussion ran for 2 hours. It was not clean and it was not conclusive. Real discussions in rooms full of people with competing interests never are. But by the end of it, three things had happened that mattered. Ben Alderman and the man named Crowder had formally committed to filing the land use complaint about the water purchases with the county commissioner the following week. Walt Pullman had offered to provide the commissioner's office with his documentation directly, which meant it would arrive through channels that had nothing to do with Brierley's objection and could not be dismissed as part of the same grievance. And James Meacham, who had been neutral for the entire 2 hours, said at the close of the meeting that in his view the procedural review period should be allowed to run its full course before any appointment was confirmed, and that he intended to communicate that view to the county clerk in writing. It was not a verdict. It was not a defeat of Dalton Hare. It was the shape of a wall being built, one person's commitment at a time, and the wall was not finished and might not hold, but it was more than had existed that morning. Hare left before the meeting formally closed, with Goss and his mother, and Margaret watched him go. He did not look at her on his way out. She thought about what Garfield had said, a man trying to convince himself as much as you, and thought there was probably something in that, something about the way people who have never been checked carry themselves until the moment they begin to understand that checking is possible. She was not triumphant about it. Triumph felt premature and also beside the point. What she felt was more like the feeling of a joint properly set. Painful process, but correctly aligned now, able to bear weight. On the ride home, Samuel wedged between them on the wagon seat and half asleep already from the long day at Pullman's, Nathaniel said, "Meacham will write to the clerk." "Yes, that matters." "Yes." She watched the road. "It might not be enough. Goss is good and Hare has money, and the appointment review might go his way regardless." "It might," Nathaniel said. "But he knows now that people will document things," she said. "That there will be records. That the next time he tries something like this, there will be a record of this time to attach to it." She paused. "That changes the calculation. Even if he wins the appointment, it changes what he'll be willing to do with it." Nathaniel thought about that for a while. "Eliza would have liked you," he said. He said it simply, looking at the road, in the tone of a factual statement. She didn't answer for a moment. It was not the kind of thing she knew how to respond to immediately, not because it was unwelcome, but because it carried the weight of everything it contained, which was considerable. "Tell me about her," Margaret said. He was quiet for a long moment, and she thought he might not. He was a man who held his interior life in certain arrangements, and disturbing those arrangements cost him something. But then he talked. Not a lot. Not for long. He talked about the window she'd chosen for the kitchen, about the way she'd laughed, which he said was louder than you expected from someone her size, about the first winter, which had been as brutal as this past one, and how she'd managed it without complaint, and then spent every subsequent October thereafter laying in supplies with a level of determined thoroughness that he'd found both moving and slightly alarming. He talked about it the way people talk about things they don't talk about, carefully, feeling for each word before he put weight on it. Margaret listened. Samuel slept between them. The mountains held the last of the light on their upper faces, and the valley below was already in the long blue shadow of early evening, and the Cross Ranch came into view at the bottom of the long slope. The cabin, the barn, the small outbuilding, everything where it was supposed to be. She had stopped thinking of it as his place sometime in the last month. She wasn't sure exactly when. That was the thing about the slow decisions. You rarely knew the moment they were made, only the moment you recognized them. She had recognized this one tonight, somewhere between the Meacham Ranch and here, between Nathaniel talking about Eliza and the mountains holding the light. She was home. It was not what she had come west expecting. It was not the elegant solution she had been desperate enough to chase across 11 days of railroad. It was a small cabin and a barn that needed 2 more boards on the west side, and a root cellar they'd lined together, and a milk cow who liked Samuel better than either adult, and a man who slept on the floor without being asked, and drove 12 miles into a blizzard for a stranger, and listened to almost everything and said about a quarter of what he heard. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, she understood now, exactly what she had been building toward without knowing it. Not the arrangement she'd planned, but the one she'd earned, one careful, honest day at a time, in difficult country, without shortcuts. Nathaniel pulled the horses up at the gate. He climbed down and reached back for Samuel, who stirred and murmured something and then went back to sleep against his shoulder, boneless the way sleeping children are, and Nathaniel carried him inside without waking him. Margaret followed them in. She built up the fire. Outside, the mountains finished the last of the light, and the stars came out over Colorado with the particular clarity that comes to high, cold places in April, and the Cross Ranch sat in the dark as it had sat through every winter Nathaniel Cross had spent on this land. The same shape against the sky, the same boards, the same window looking at the mountains the way Eliza had wanted it to look. Not the same inside, though, not anymore. The clerk's letter arrived on a Tuesday in the last week of April, and Brierly sent word to the ranch before noon. Margaret read the message twice, standing at the gate, where the boy from town had handed it to her, the morning still cool enough that her breath showed, the mud from last night's rain drying at the edges in the pale sun. The message was 4 sentences. Brierly's handwriting, compact and precise. The Appointment Review Board has requested a postponement of confirmation pending further examination of the procedural objections. Hare's counsel has been notified. This is not a final ruling. Come when you can. She folded it and went inside. Nathaniel was at the table eating breakfast before the day's work, and he looked at her face the way he always looked at her face now. Directly, without pretense of not looking. She handed him the note. He read it. He set it down. He picked up his coffee cup and drank from it and looked at the table for a moment. Postponement, he said. Not a denial, not yet. But not a confirmation either. No. She sat down across from him. Brierly said it's the best outcome we could realistically have gotten at this stage. A postponement means the review board took the objection seriously enough to want more time. It means Goss didn't walk in and dismiss it in an afternoon. Nathaniel turned the note over in his hands. How long is the postponement? 60 days, Brierly thinks. Maybe 90. He'll know more this week. Samuel came in from outside where he'd been feeding the chickens, mud on his boots, and a particular expression of focused contentment on his face that he got when he'd been doing something useful. He looked at the two of them at the table and read the room the way children read rooms. Not the specifics, but the weight. Did something happen? He said. Something good, Margaret said. Or something that might become good. We're still watching it. Samuel accepted this with the pragmatism of a child who has learned that most important things come in the form of might rather than certain. He took his boots off at the door and sat down for breakfast. And the morning went on the way mornings did. The ordinary structure of it, the small requirements of a household and a working ranch, which did not pause for legal proceedings or suspended appointments or the complex arithmetic of what might happen in 60 days. The next 6 weeks were the strangest of the whole period, because they were in many ways the most ordinary. The case was with Brierly, and Brierly was doing what Brierly did, and Margaret had given him everything she had and had nothing left to give until he asked for more. The land use complaint was with the county commissioner, Walt Pullman's documentation was where it needed to be, and James Meacham had sent his letter to the clerk as promised. The machinery was in motion, and the machinery required time. There was nothing to do but wait, and waiting was something Margaret had never done well, which meant she directed the energy somewhere. She directed it at the ranch. Not in the way she had in January, when she was establishing herself and proving something. This was different, less self-conscious, more simply absorbed. She had been watching the operation for 4 months with the eye of someone learning a system, and she had a clear picture by now of what it was, what it could be, and what the gap between those two things looked like. The gap was not insurmountable. It was the gap that accumulates when one person has been managing what 2 people built, when daily survival has crowded out the forward-looking work, when there is no one to hold the other end of things while you step back and see them whole. She talked to Nathaniel about it one evening in early May, with the door open to the warm night and the last of the sunset still showing at the edge of the sky. The south pasture, she said. The grass there is better than you're using it for. If you ran the cattle rotation differently, moved them through in 3 sections instead of 2, you'd get more recovery time on each section and better weight on the animals by fall. He looked at the fire, not dismissing it, thinking. That's more fencing, he said. 1 additional cross fence, about 300 yards. Pullman did it 2 seasons ago. He said it paid for itself in the first year. He was quiet for a moment. You've been talking to Pullman about my pasture. I've been talking to Pullman about rotational grazing because I wanted to understand whether it was applicable here. She looked at him steadily. It is. He almost said something about her doing things without telling him. She could see him almost saying it. Then he didn't, because they were past that, had been past it for months, and he knew it. 300 yards of cross fence, he said. Pullman would lend the post pounder. Samuel could carry stakes. It's a week's work, maybe less. He looked at the open door and the dark coming in at the edges of the light. All right, he said, show me what you're thinking. She got paper and drew it out, the pasture sections and the proposed fence line and the rotation schedule. And he looked at it and moved the fence line slightly east to avoid a soft ground section she hadn't known about, and then looked at it again and said she was right about the recovery time. He'd seen it at a ranch he'd worked on in his 20s in Wyoming, had forgotten about it. They stayed at the table until almost 10, which was late for people who were up before dawn, and Samuel fell asleep on the cot in the background without either of them noticing the exact moment it happened. That was May. The fence went in over 5 days in the second week, Pullman lending the post pounder as promised, and the cattle moved into the new rotation, and the south pasture began its first proper rest in years, the grass coming back in the way. Grass does when you stop asking too much of it too fast. The letter from Brierly came on a Thursday in mid-June. Not a message this time, a full letter, 3 pages, which was more than Brierly had ever written her at once, and Margaret knew before she finished the first paragraph that something significant had shifted. Goss had withdrawn. Not from the case entirely. Hare still had representation, but Goss specifically had withdrawn, citing a conflict that he did not specify, but which Brierly, with the carefully neutral phrasing of a man choosing not to editorialize, described as apparently related to a separate matter involving the Denver firm and a land transaction that had drawn attention from the territorial attorney's office. Margaret read that sentence 3 times. She did not know what it meant in full. She did not need to. What it meant in outline was that Harlan Goss, the man who had made their 40-page response feel like weather, had removed himself from the situation, and the reason involved the territorial attorney's office, which was a level of scrutiny that operated well above the county and which Goss would not have attracted and then retreated from unless the situation warranted it. The second page of Brierly's letter was more careful. He said that he had no direct information about what had triggered the territorial attention, but that Pullman's documentation about the Aldis purchases had been filed with the commissioner in early May, and that the commissioner's office had forwarded certain elements of it to the territorial land office as a matter of standard procedure, and that what happened after that was outside his knowledge but within his informed speculation. He said he wanted Margaret to understand that the machinery she had helped set in motion had moved in directions neither of them had fully predicted, and that this was not always a comfortable thing even when the direction was the right one. The third page said, "The Appointment Review Board has issued a preliminary finding against confirmation. The finding is not final for 30 days, during which Hare's new counsel may file a response. However, I am advised by a colleague familiar with this board's practice that a preliminary finding of this nature is rarely reversed. I wanted you to hear this from me before you heard it from someone else. And I wanted to say plainly that the outcome, if it holds, is the product of your preparation, your documentation, and your willingness to be the person who started the conversation. Dorothea Marsh asked me to include her thanks. She has said she will write to you herself in time." Margaret sat down. She was at the kitchen table, alone, Nathaniel in the far pasture, Samuel somewhere outside. And she sat with Brierly's 3 pages and the late morning light coming through the window that faced the mountains, and she stayed there for a while. She thought about the road. January, the snow coming down in sheets, Samuel going quiet against her arm in the particular way that had frightened her more than the cold. She thought about Briggs riding east and the sound of hooves fading and the 30 seconds in which she simply could not think at all. She thought about what she'd said to herself, "Not here. Don't fall apart here." She had not fallen apart. She had done something harder than that. She had stayed assembled, day after day, in a situation that offered every reason to come undone, and she had done it not through any special strength, but through the specific ordinary stubbornness of a person who has a child depending on them and cannot afford the luxury of collapse. That was not heroism. She knew the difference between heroism and stubbornness, and she had no interest in misidentifying which one had gotten her through the winter. It was stubbornness and need and the accumulated small decisions of daily life, each one individually unremarkable, collectively the thing that had held. She was still sitting there when Nathaniel came in at noon. He looked at the letter on the table. He sat down across from her and picked it up and read it. All 3 pages. She watched him read it, When he set it down, he did not say anything for a moment. He looked at his hands, then at her. Preliminary finding, he said, against confirmation, 30 days for a response. Brierly says it holds. He says rarely reversed. Nathaniel nodded slowly. He was doing the same thing she had done, processing not just the news but the weight of the news, what it meant across the full length of what it had cost to get here. Goss withdrawing, he said. The territorial attorney. I know. She looked at the letter. We didn't do that part. That came from somewhere else. Maybe. Or maybe the ground was already unstable and Pullman's documentation shifted it enough. She thought about that. Either way, it's not ours to manage. What's ours is done. He looked at her steadily. Not entirely, he said. Not referring to the case. He said it in a different tone, the tone he used for the things he said carefully, the quarter of what he heard that he chose to give sound. She looked at him. No, she said. Not entirely. The kitchen was quiet. The window held the mountains the way it always held them, the way Eliza had intended. Nathaniel Cross was not a man who arrived at things quickly. He had arrived at this over 6 months, in the manner of a person who does not trust speed in things that matter, who needs to be certain of ground before he puts weight on it, who has been taught by particular losses that certainty costs time and the cost is worth it. Margaret had watched the process without trying to accelerate it, because she understood it, and because she had her own version of the same caution, and because the thing being decided was the kind that needed to be right more than it needed to be fast. He said, I'd like you to stay. Not as a practical arrangement, not as a winter necessity or a work exchange. The sentence was plain and direct and carried everything it was supposed to carry, nothing more and nothing less. She said, I was already staying. He almost smiled. It arrived the way his smiles did, briefly, close to the surface, gone before you could be certain you'd seen it. Samuel too, he said. Samuel too. He nodded once and looked at the table, and she looked at the table, and the ordinary afternoon went on around them. The sound of whatever Samuel was doing outside, the cattle somewhere in the new pasture rotation, the warm June air moving through the open door. It was not a romantic scene. It was two people at a kitchen table who had lived alongside each other through a hard winter and a harder spring, and had arrived at a decision that both of them had been making incrementally for months without naming it, and now they were naming it, and the name was simple. Here, us, this. That was enough. That was the whole of it. The preliminary finding held. 30 days passed, and Hare's new counsel filed a response, and the response was reviewed, and in the last week of July the board issued its final ruling. The appointment was denied. The denial was formal and procedural in its language and said nothing about fraud or abandoned women in blizzards or water rights purchased through proxies, because legal rulings rarely say the human thing directly. What it said in the flat language of official findings, was that sufficient questions had been raised regarding the nominee's conduct in matters of public trust to warrant withholding confirmation at this time. Brierly sent a single line, final. It held. Well done. Margaret showed it to Nathaniel. He read it and handed it back and went back to the fence post he'd been examining, because there was always something that needed examining, and the ranch did not pause for legal rulings, final or otherwise. She showed it to Samuel, who was 7.5 now, and had grown 2 inches since January, and could handle a fence staple without supervision, and knew the name of every one of the cattle, and had a particular relationship with the milk cow that remained, Margaret thought, the most genuinely reciprocal friendship on the property. Does that mean the bad man can't be on the water board? Samuel said. Yes, Margaret said. That's what it means. He thought about it. Did you do that? Some of it. A lot of people helped. He thought about it more. Mr. Brierly helped. Yes. And Mr. Pullman. Yes. And Mr. Cross. She looked at her son. He had Peter's steadiness. She'd said that to Nathaniel months ago, and it was still true, still the most accurate thing she could say about the particular quality Samuel carried. He had it in the way he thought things through before he said them, in the way he didn't rush to the comfortable answer. Yes, she said. Mr. Cross helped. Samuel looked at her with the directness that children deploy when they've decided to say the thing they've been thinking. He's not really just Mr. Cross anymore, though, he said. Is he? It was not quite a question. No, Margaret said. He's not. Samuel nodded, satisfied, and went back to whatever he'd been doing. She found Dorothea Marsh's letter in the mail that same week. 4 pages in a careful, slightly cramped hand, written over what seemed like several days based on the way the ink changed slightly between sections. Dorothea wrote the way she spoke, with no particular decoration, just the facts of what she was thinking and what she felt, laid out in the order they arrived. She wrote that she had not expected to feel what she felt when Brierly told her the ruling. She had expected relief, she said, or perhaps a kind of cold satisfaction, the feeling of an account finally balanced. What she actually felt was something she didn't have a good word for. Not quite grief and not quite release, but somewhere between them. Like setting down something heavy that you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten what it felt like to have your hands free. She wrote that she was going to Missouri in the fall. She had a sister there, and her sister had been asking her to come for a year, and she had been saying no because Colorado was where she'd washed up when the worst thing happened, and she'd stayed in it out of a stubbornness she now understood had been its own kind of hiding. Going to Missouri was not running, she wrote, it was choosing. She thought she understood the difference now. She wrote at the end, "You are the reason any of this happened. Not only you, I know that, but you were the one who stood up in a room full of people who had decided to manage it quietly and said the thing plainly. I don't think I could have done that. I'm glad you could. I hope Colorado is good to you. I think it might be now." Margaret read it twice and then folded it and put it in the box where she kept the letters that mattered. Brierly's notes, Peter's last letter from before he died, the 4 letters from Hare that had started everything. She put Dorothea's letter in that box, because it belonged there, because it was part of the record of this year, and the year deserved a complete record. The second winter came in October, earlier than the first, with the same indifference that Colorado weather always had toward human plans and preferences. Nathaniel had said in September that it would be a hard winter, reading the signs the way he'd been reading them for 15 years on this land, the way the animals were putting on weight, the way the grass was going yellow earlier than usual, the way the cloud formations over the northwest ridge looked in the first week of September. Margaret had learned enough to take his reading seriously, and they had laid in supplies with a thoroughness that would have impressed Eliza Cross had she been there to see it. They were ready when it came, not comfortable. Ready is a different thing from comfortable, and no one who has spent a winter in the high country confuses the two. Ready means you've done what you could. It means the hay is dry and the root cellar is full and the window gaps are caulked, and the wood is stacked deep enough to be confident but not so deep that confidence becomes carelessness. It means you've thought through the possible failures and prepared for the ones you could and made your peace with the ones you couldn't. In the second week of November, Nathaniel came in from the barn with his left arm held at an angle that Margaret recognized immediately as wrong. He said nothing at first. He came in and stood in the cabin with the cold still coming off him and his arm held carefully against his side, and she looked at him and said, "What happened?" "Ice on the barn roof," he said. "I came off the ladder wrong." She got him to the table and got his coat off and looked at his arm, which was not broken. She had looked at enough injuries to know the difference between broken and badly damaged, but was badly enough damaged that it was not going to be a working arm for some time. The shoulder, the way he was holding it, the way it moved when she examined it carefully, told her it was a separation, possibly a partial tear of something, and either way it meant weeks before he'd have full use of it. He knew it too. She could see it in his face, not the pain, which he managed with the stoic efficiency of a man long accustomed to managing pain alone, but the calculation of what it meant for the ranch in the second week of November with a hard winter already announced and everything that needed doing before the deep cold set in. "I can do it," she said. He looked at her. "The barn work, the feeding, what needs doing outside." She met his eyes. "Tell me what order, and I'll do it in that order." "Margaret, Nathaniel." She said his name the way he said hers when they were past the point of arguing about the thing. "Tell me what order." He told her. It was not the first time she'd done the outdoor work alone. There had been days in the spring when he was at Pullman's or in town, and she'd handled the morning and evening feeding without difficulty. But this was different in scale and season. November feeding was not March feeding. The cattle needed more, required more attention, the water supply required more management, the barn itself required checking and rechecking in the way it did when the temperature was falling and the risk of ice buildup on the roof, which she now understood had put Nathaniel on the ladder in the first place, was something that had to be managed proactively rather than reactively. Samuel helped. Not in the performing way, not in the I am helping way of a child who wants credit for the effort. He just appeared in the barn in the mornings when she appeared, already in his coat, and did what she asked and then did the next thing without being asked. And Margaret thought that whatever Peter's steadiness had given him, the past year on this land had given him something additional. A practical groundedness, a willingness to be where the work was. Nathaniel managed the inside, the fire, the food, the accounting that needed doing, the decisions that required someone to be available to think without also carrying a feed bucket. He was a worse patient than he was a man, which was to say he was not a patient at all, and Margaret told him so directly when he tried to do things with one arm that required two, and he accepted the correction with the slightly sour expression of a man who knows he is wrong and dislikes knowing it. 3 weeks. That was how long the heavy period lasted. The 3 weeks in which the arm was limited enough that the outdoor work was primarily hers, and the ranch depended on her in the specific way it had never quite fully done before, not in this degree. The ranch did not suffer. She did not know, at the time, whether it would. She found out by doing it, by getting up before dawn into the cold dark and going to the barn and feeding and watering and checking and coming back in and making breakfast, and then going out again and doing what came next and then the next thing after that. In the order Nathaniel had told her and in the order that presented itself when the order he'd told her ran out. She was tired in the bone-deep way of sustained physical work in cold weather. She was tired in a way she hadn't been since the first weeks at the ranch in January, when everything was unfamiliar and every task cost extra because she was still learning the specific language of this place. But this tiredness felt different from that one. That one had the anxiety of uncertainty in it, the question of whether she was doing it right, whether she was enough. This one was clean. It was just the tiredness of work done. On the 22nd day, Nathaniel came out to the barn in the morning with both arms in use, moving carefully but fully present, and took up his share of the feeding without preamble. She looked at him. "You sure?" she said. "I'm sure," he said. She handed him the feed bucket. They worked this morning in silence, which was their normal, a silence that had long since stopped being uncomfortable and had become its own form of conversation, the kind that only develops between people who have spent enough consecutive hours in each other's company to stop needing to fill every space. When they came in for breakfast, Nathaniel stood at the stove and said, without turning around, "You kept it." "Yes," she said. "Everything." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, doing something with the pan that didn't require the attention he was giving it. "I kept thinking from inside," he said, "that I should be out there, that it was too much for one person." He paused. "It wasn't." "No," she said. "It wasn't." He turned around. He looked at her with the direct, unguarded expression he used when he'd decided to say the thing instead of keeping it. "I want to make this legal," he said. "The arrangement, if you're willing." He meant marriage, said it the way he said most things that mattered, plainly, without decoration, looking straight at her. "Not because of the land or the practical—" He stopped, tried again. "Because I want it to be right. What we are. I want it named." She looked at him. She thought about the January road and Briggs riding away and arriving at this cabin with $12 and Samuel and the particular desperation of a person who has run out of other options. She thought about what she'd thought marriage was supposed to be, an arrangement, a solution, a transaction dressed in respectable clothing. She thought about what it had turned out to be, built not in a single decision, but in the accumulation of all the small ones, in fence posts and root cellar boards and legal letters and a kitchen table at 10 at night, with a drawn map between them. "Yes," she said. "I'm willing." He nodded. He turned back to the stove. She sat down at the table and something in her chest settled, quietly, the way a foundation settles when the weight above it is finally properly distributed. Samuel came in from outside and looked at the two of them and looked again. "Did something happen?" he said for the second time in 6 months, reading the room with the same uncanny accuracy. "Yes," Margaret said. "Good or bad?" "Good," she said. "Very good." He looked at Nathaniel, who had turned from the stove with the expression of a man who is trying not to look like what he currently is. "Okay," Samuel said, with the equanimity of a child who has learned that adult decisions arrive on adult timelines, and his job is to be ready when they do. He sat down for breakfast. They married in March, A year almost exactly from the first time Margaret had walked into Brierly's office with a folded list and a problem she was determined to build into something useful. The ceremony was small. Brierly there, the Pullmans, Clara Meacham, Dorothea Marsh, who had delayed her trip to Missouri to attend, and who embraced Margaret in the hotel lobby afterward with a fierceness that said everything the four-page letter had also said, only faster. Samuel stood beside Nathaniel during the ceremony with the gravity of a child who understands that he is present at something significant, and when it was over he shook Nathaniel's hand with a formality that made three people in the room visibly struggle with their composure, and Nathaniel shook it back with equal gravity and then put his hand briefly on Samuel's head in a gesture that was not quite a pat and not quite anything else, just a hand resting for a moment, claiming something, or acknowledging something claimed. The ranch in spring looked different from the ranch in winter. The same bones, the same boards, the same window facing the mountains, but the light was different and the mud was slowly losing its argument with the sun and the south pasture, the one with the new cross fence and the rotational system Margaret had proposed, and Nathaniel had adjusted and they had built together in 5 days with Pullman's post-pounder, was already showing the particular dense green of grass that has had time to recover its depth. Margaret stood at the kitchen window one morning in late April and looked at the mountains the way Eliza Cross had stood there and looked at them and thought about that. She thought about it honestly, without sentimentality, the way you think about things when you want to get them right. Not to possess the past, but to understand what she was standing inside. She was standing inside someone else's grief and someone else's vision and someone else's particular choice about where to put a window, and those things were part of the ground she was building on. And she thought you could honor that without being diminished by it, that you could carry what a place had been and still make it what it was becoming, that these were not in competition. Nathaniel came in from the barn and saw her at the window. He stopped. He looked at her, looking at the mountains. "I do that too," he said. "Still." "I know," she said. "I've seen you." He came and stood beside her, not touching, just beside. The mountains in the window, the same view, the two of them looking at it together the way two people look at something when they've both decided it belongs to them. There are things that break you, and there are things that forge you, and the difficulty is that they can look identical from the outside. Two people standing in a storm, one destroyed and one changed, and you cannot tell which is which until afterward, until you see what they build from it, until you see whether the damage becomes a wall or a foundation. Margaret Ellison, Margaret Cross now, on the legal paper Brierly had filed, though she thought of the name as a work in progress the same way the ranch was a work in progress, had arrived in Colorado territory with nothing she intended to arrive with and everything she hadn't known she needed. She had been set down in the worst possible place at the worst possible time by a man who had calculated that she was disposable, and she had declined the calculation. Not dramatically, not in a single act of defiance. She had declined it the way she'd done everything that mattered. One day, one task, one carefully documented fact at a time. That was the thing about survival on difficult ground. It did not announce itself. It did not look from the inside like triumph or strength or any of the words that get applied to it afterward. It looked like getting up before dawn. It looked like carrying feed buckets in the cold. It looked like keeping letters and learning the name of a lawyer and talking to a woman in a hotel kitchen and sitting at a table with a man who listened to almost everything and asking him again and again what he needed. It looked, in the end, like this. A kitchen window and a view of mountains and a child coming in the back door with mud on his boots and a man putting his coat on the hook by the door with the ease of someone entirely at home, and the spring coming in at the edges of everything, slow and certain and entirely indifferent to whatever winter thought it had settled. Outside, the cross fence cast its line across the south pasture in the morning light. The cattle moved where they were supposed to move. The mountains sat where Eliza had always wanted them, holding the horizon steady. Margaret turned from the window and started breakfast. The day had work in it, and the work was hers, and she was glad of it.